Um, I'm grateful to be here. I'm grateful for this invitation, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to have a conversation with you this evening and to hear your thoughts. And I'm grateful to see young men and women here who can reflect upon how many of these issues, the issues that the young people in the book talk about, affect their own lives. I'd also like to thank C-SPAN for being here and for my colleague Christina from Johns Hopkins Press, who's been wonderful. Now, I come to this really from the perspective of a doctor, and I appreciate your reading those words. That's where I ended up, in understanding that we couldn't discard these young people as sick or bad, but we had to understand what was influencing their lives. In '89, I took a job as a primary care doctor at Boston City Hospital. Now, Boston City Hospital is a municipal hospital. Many of you may know it. And I began as a primary care doctor. And as my friend Miles knows, Boston City Hospital serves mostly the people in Roxbury, Dorchester, and Mattapan, mostly the African-American communities in Boston. I was astounded by the fact that in primary care, I saw very few young men, particularly young men of color. But when I walked through the emergency room, through the orthopedic clinic, through the surgical wards, I saw lots of young black men, most of them injured by violence, and most of them thought to be thugs or drug dealers by the providers taking care of them. Well, one day I was walking through the stairwell and I ran into a colleague of mine, Dr. Jonathan Woodson, an African-American surgeon who I knew from my time training at a hospital across town in Boston, Mass General Hospital. And he was frustrated. And he said, you know, I saw a young guy a few weeks ago, and he had been shot and almost died. And I took him to the operating room, and we were able to save his life. But then a few weeks later, he said, I'm riding in my car, and I hear the same young man is dead. And there is knowledge that we have about this recurring cycle of violence, that people who get injured tend to get injured again. And he said to me, we have to do something. Now, I didn't really know what to do at that time, but I knew that I didn't completely understand the lives of the young people that I was interacting with. My life had been, I grew up in Queens, New York. My dad was a dentist. My mom was a teacher. And I just had a different perspective. I had a different perspective than many of the young people I saw in Boston. And so I began to talk to young people using a method of qualitative research. That is, I took a tape recorder, I went through all of the human subjects things that I had to do, but really ended up sitting opposite these young people while they were in the hospital on surgical ward and hearing their stories. And what I learned in that time was it wasn't as simple as I and my colleagues thought. We somehow thought that, and I would put it this way, young black men didn't just get shot, they got themselves shot. It was easy when you saw this endless stream of young people coming in with gunshot wounds to assume and to talk to them as if they had done this to themselves. It's also true that every day in the newspapers, this was true in Boston at that time, it's been recently true in Philadelphia where I now live, but I know it's true in Baltimore. We track the bodies. We report on homicide. And homicide is a devastating outcome. But if we only count homicide, we're looking at the tip of the iceberg of violent injury. The CDC reports that for every homicide, there are 94 violent injuries that did not result in death. And we know that young people who are injured not only bear the physical scars, but they bear the emotional and psychological scars that come from violence. We also know that if you take people who have been victims of gunshot wounds or stab wounds and you follow them forward for 5 years, 45% of those people will have been shot or stabbed again. So something about getting injured puts you at risk for getting injured again. Now, one could say, well, gee, these are bad people doing bad things. They get shot. We patch them up. They go back out, and they just do bad things again, and they get shot, and case closed. That is, in many ways, the dismissing idea. But as I talked with these young people, I realized there was something more going on. And I want to talk to you about two things tonight, two ideas, and then engage you in a conversation about this. Because I think it does matter how we see these young people and how we see their experiences. I'd like to first talk about the impact of trauma itself. Over the past 20 to 30 years, there's been an explosion of knowledge in trauma and what we know about violent injury and what it can do. We know, for example, from studies of combat veterans and from studies of victims of sexual assault, that victims have psychological symptoms afterwards, so-called post-traumatic stress disorder. But even if you don't have the full post-traumatic stress, you may have other manifestations like depression. So some of the symptoms that you may see, and you may recognize these in young people or others that you know who have been exposed to violence, is something we call hypervigilance. That is the sense that you're always in danger, the twitchy jumpiness that you sometimes see in people who feel unsafe. I mentioned depression. But we sometimes see one of the major hallmarks of post-traumatic stress is avoidance. That is, don't want to come out of the house, don't want to go to school, don't want to do anything. Nightmares and flashbacks are common, and often young people describe using marijuana or alcohol simply as a way to keep the nightmares away. Insomnia, anxiety, those are symptoms of post-traumatic stress. But one other, and I think particularly striking manifestation of post-traumatic stress is what's called emotional numbing. And I saw this most directly in a young man named David. I met David when he was in the hospital. He had been shot in the side. It was not a life-threatening injury, but in the same instance where he was shot, his cousin was killed, and his cousin was his best friend. They had driven to the projects to visit some friends there. While they were sitting in the car, someone walked up to the car and fired on it. He believed that it was a mistaken identity situation, but I asked David if he would simply describe to me what happened in the way that I could get a story that was different from what the newspapers would report. And here's what he said. All right, I was in an incident where me and my cousin had went to a housing development, Green Street housing development, and I wind up getting shot, and my cousin wind up getting killed. He paused for a moment, searching the floor with his eyes. And there's nowhere to go from there with that one. He didn't want to talk any more about it, but I asked him, can you tell me a little bit more? All right, he consented. Antoine had come and picked me up from my house, and we was on our way to our grandmother's house. We was going to wash clothes, and he was just going to pick me up. Then we wound up leaving the house because I had to go get some change. We wound up going to Stop and Shop to get some change. And then we wound up hooking up with some of our friends to go see some girls over in the projects. As soon as we got there, we wound up getting shot. He paused again and looked at me. That's really about as much as I really want to say about that. Can you say anything about what happened after that? I asked him. Well, I wasn't really thinking too much when I was getting shot, but afterwards, when I got out of the car, I seen my cousin laying on the ground. I guess he must have got out of the car at some point in time and ran, but I never seen it happen. Then when I seen him on the ground, even though I was shot too, I had to run to him to see if Antoine was all right. When I ran to him, I noticed that this liquid was coming from his pants, so it was really tense. I can't really describe it how it felt, but it was very unpleasant. It was a very unpleasant feeling. And then they rolled him over, and when they rolled him over, I seen his eyes, and his eyes was looking straight up, looked all glassy. Right then, I was hoping that he'd be all right. And then the police officers, they were all badgering me